All right, everybody, hello. I hope that this recording is working and that the audio quality is okay and that you can hear me. Hi, my name is Robert Gorwa, and I'm a postdoc at the Berlin Social Science Center, which is a publicly funded research institute, obviously based in Berlin. I'm really excited to be here with you all to talk a little bit about some of the work I and colleagues have been doing on platform governance, which is a hot buzzword these days, something you may all be familiar with, but also, might not be too familiar with in terms of direct impacts on your work. So I'm going to give a kind of condensed version of the tutorial I'm giving next week. And I should say offhand that I apologize. I've just gotten off a flight. I'm here in Seoul a little early, and I wasn't really able to sleep much. I'm pretty zonked. So hopefully this is as coherent as my sleep-deprived brain can manage. I hope you'll bear with me. I hope there'll be a relatively good indication of what I'll be talking about next week, although I think I'm going to go a little bit more in depth in some of the case studies. So anyway, I'm going to go for about 30 minutes here. That's at least my target. And thanks again for tuning in. Let's get started. The short title of this talk is Platform Governance. The long title of this talk is Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Justice Implications for Automated Governance Systems as Deployed by User-Generated Content Platforms. So a much longer mouthful, but I think a probably more accurate depiction of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm interested in translating some of the insights that I've been doing in recent work, especially with the focus on one paper that I'll talk about, which looked at automated content moderation systems, and provide a little bit of a preliminary overview into some of their kind of fact implications in the real world. I'm going to start with some context about platform governance and its key concepts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the paper that I did with my colleagues Ruben Binz and Christian Katzenbach, which looked at different forms of automated content moderation in practice and also kind of proposed a theoretical framework for looking at this and understanding this. And I'm going to zoom in after that with two kind of very short case studies. In the tutorial in person, we'll go into further depth into these two systems. There are two systems that I've chosen: YouTube's Content ID, the copyright domain, and Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism's hash database or shared industry hash database in the terrorism, violent extremism case, to kind of zoom in a little bit at the political economy and also technical implementations of some of these systems in practice. And then we're going to close with just a few reflections as to what I think might be interesting here for all of you, those of you that are working more in terms of applied engineering contexts and might even be developing these kinds of systems yourselves. Let's start with a few definitions before we get to platform governance. Is this notion of content moderation, which of course has become more and more prevalent in the public discourse lately, but it's still something that not everybody has a really clear handle on. What exactly is content moderation? Where do we draw the boundaries of what we consider content moderation and platform governance or something else? So the definition that I like to use personally is one of the broadest and oldest ones from a legal scholar, James Grimmelman. This paper was published in 2015, but I think it's about a decade older in terms of its earlier drafts. And this definition is a really wide one, which is really kind of inspired by a lot of early Web 2.0 platforms and even community and other online spaces before the massive mega platform boom of the last decade. So James Grimmelman talks about content moderation in this really broad sense as not just a specific mechanism or bureaucratic process through which a platform might be actioning specific types of content. So things that their users are posting, doing, saying, tweets, posts, reels, stories, etc., but much more kind of broadly as the governance mechanisms that structure participation in a community and facilitate cooperation and prevent abuse. So we'll talk a little bit more about what this means, but in Grimmelman's definition, what I think is really interesting is that he's talking not just about, community standards or community guidelines and the ways that platforms enforce them, but he's talking about much softer kind of things. So there's a whole spectrum of soft to hard kind of moderation functions, which range from norms in a community or the design of specific architectures that can be engineered in certain ways to promote certain types of behavior, or the way that new users are kind of vetted when they come into a new community, the way that the moderators are functioning, community moderators functioning. These are all parts of an ecosystem of content moderation. In practice, and there's been some interesting scholarship in the last 5-6 years, which has kind of taken us from this early space of community-driven content moderation that James was mostly talking about, spaces like Wikipedia, for example, into what Sarah Roberts, some of you may know her work, especially those of you more in the kind of comm space, her work on content moderation labor. She's kind of identified a interesting shift or an important shift that has happened from community moderation to what she calls commercial content moderation. So today, a lot of the things that we talk about when we talk about content moderation are usually this kind of broader, more bureaucratic set of practices. And we can think about them through, at least inside companies, this kind of big alphabet soup of different actors, right? So different platforms will have different names for these different organizational bodies or sub-organizational bodies. But it seems like in a company like Facebook, they'll have various teams of varying sizes that will kind of shape and do the first cut at setting the rules. These are folks that might be led by former prosecutors or lawyers, often people who are working in kind of trust and safety and have a lot of experience in this. Of course, there are kind of legendary folks in the community who have been working on these issues for a long time and have kind of developed community guidelines across multiple platforms. I've just very quickly stylized this as happening in 3 layers. Maybe this isn't entirely accurate, but in terms of 3 different kind of important roles that are going on here, we have various policy teams that are kind of developing the granular rules of the road, and sitting on top of them are the folks who are kind of making the hard-hitting decisions about whether or not these are sufficient in certain cases, whether exemptions need to be taken, whether or not these specific rules are going to create some kind of legal liability. And then we have the enforcement structures which allow these rules to then be translated into practice. And in practice, this seems to be usually a mix of either in-house kind of community operations, moderation staff. This has been growing in the last 5-6 years. Companies like Facebook are bringing more and more people in-house in places like Dublin, but also Austin, Germany, Berlin. As well as through, as Sarah Roberts and other researchers, other journalists increasingly now too have shown, a kind of growing, sprawling chain of global content moderator labor supply, basically. A lot of this is through a value chain of outsourcing, business processing companies, these kinds of things, right? This is often, when you look at the news, what people are kind of talking about increasingly when we're talking about content moderation. And what has been interesting in this space is that there's been an increasing interest, I think, especially by critically minded academics, to kind of start shifting the conversation away from one of moderation, but also towards one of governance. And we can talk a little bit about why that is and what I think this gives us that maybe a more narrow moderation lens doesn't. But this was probably born out of this observation that through moderation, but not only through moderation, platforms engage in important political decisions and shape their users' lives in various ways. So if we paraphrase digital media scholars like Charlton Gillespie, this isn't surprising given that literally everything on the platform has been architected for a certain way usually, right? So just by interacting by a platform, then by definition, you as a user are often having some kind of minute governance or governmentality exerted over you and your behavior, right? So starting from the bottom of this list, this starts from kind of infrastructure and interface design, the way that menus are specified, the way that the feed and other kind of content delivery mechanisms work. These can be very direct forms through which platforms kind of shape their users in more subtle ways. As Grimmelman would have said, there's also kind of these broader structures of norms on different communities, right, which also kind of engage in governance because platforms have a large kind of impact and influence in shaping those norms. But I think most crucially, this is where I guess the rubber meets the road on the governance side, is that legal scholars and also political scientists, public policy people like myself have gotten interested in the way that they have actually been creating rules. So we can call them, different things. Some people might call them rules. Some people might call them almost quasi-legal, kind of quasi-judicial structures. But basically, platform companies are increasingly setting codified rules over what can and cannot be done by their platform. And this has a lot of political as well as economic implications, right? And this is, I think, where this question of platform governance has become more tangible in the last few years, because we're seeing various domains through which the political impact of platforms is becoming more apparent, right? And of course, there are many examples of this. But on the economic side, these are also kind of tantamount. So the way that platforms engage with complementary actors. So this isn't just user-generated content platforms, social media platforms engaging with their advertisers or developers, for example. This is also marketplace platforms that are kind of setting the market conditions, providing tools like APIs, and basically kind of governing the way that other actors are using their platform. And these can be more informal in terms of practices, or in many cases, these are actually codified in terms of supplier contractual agreements, et cetera. But all of these kind of constitute arguably some form of governance. So this is kind of how I see platform governance in a nutshell. And this is where I, in my work, have been trying to broaden out the content moderation conversation a little bit. So the way that I have defined it and conceptualized it in my work is thinking about platform governance not just as a thing, but actually as a process. So the process is how platform companies are setting and enforcing standards around their platform's use, right? So this is broader than just narrow moderation. This might involve a whole stake of other kind of activities. And then, crucially, the way that other actors are trying to influence or control in that, or meddle in that in various ways. So this has taken it from just being, I guess, a practice and a process, but also, importantly, in my understanding, a site of increasingly fruitful political contestation. So the reason I think that the conversation has kind of turned towards notions of platform governance in the last couple of years is I think it can do important work kind of capturing two important dimensions of this debate, which are often summarized as like the governance of and the governance by platforms. So there's been a long body of work kind of documenting the notion of governance by platforms. We've already talked about this. But increasingly, policy scholars like myself, digital media scholars, people working in media policy, people working just in tech policy and internet regulation more broadly, are getting more interested in the kind of governance of platforms, of platform companies. And this is what I think important, just because there's obviously been a huge amount of interest in this from policymakers around the world in the last 5 years, especially. So we can think about different ways, and empirically we do see different ways that platform companies are increasingly facing a growing number of regulatory demands, both in terms of the kind of underpinning legal liability frameworks that may have always been there, things like the e-commerce directive in the EU or the infamous Section 230 of the CDA, Communications Decency Act in the US, but as well as a growing number of self-regulatory initiatives or industry-wide regulatory initiatives that companies are doing voluntarily, a growing number of national level regulations that specifically prescribe how companies should be engaging in their platform governance, how they should be moderating content, how they should be building out transparency around all these systems. And we're going to see on the next slide a little bit of how that's going down, as well as slowly but steadily a growing number of supranational frameworks that are kind of entering this fray too. So this is things like trade agreements and other kind of other agreements reached through international fora. And I guess the core argument that we're trying to exert in this scholarship, and that I'm trying to exert in this scholarship, is this idea of kind of co-constitution, that it's very difficult to understand how the governance by platforms looks when so much of that is kind of contingent on what the regulators and the policymakers are doing. And there's so much that we can see in terms of changes in community guidelines, for example, that seem to be a pretty direct result of specific forms of government pressure, government intervention. And on the flip side, what the platforms are already doing, and of course have been doing in this kind of politically shaped context, is also increasingly kind of prefiguring the scope of potential policy action. So things that platforms are doing in terms of the solutions to their trust and safety problems that they start building now are increasingly the kinds of things that seem to be codified in law. So this is super interesting, and we can talk about this a little bit more later. To kind of wrap up the contextual bit, at the beginning here, I just want to very briefly mention that, as most of you are probably aware, there's a growing kind of climate of policy intervention globally, mainly in high-income democracies, but there are some exemptions, of policy intervention that's trying to exert pressure on specific content governance processes as enacted by the major user-generated content or social media platforms, right? And this, I think, can be kind of roughly categorized into two buckets. So those taking formal regulatory interventions, basically binding law. So whether we look at the NetzDG, the Network Enforcement Act in Germany, the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act in Singapore, the Loi Avia in France. There's another kind of NetzDG copycat law, which was passed in Austria recently, as well as kind of more ambitious, regional initiatives like the DSA package that is currently being negotiated. You know, we see a bunch more kind of formal intervention where governments are jumping into the fray, and they're trying to prescribe specific rules around content evaluation systems, basically. We can also talk a little bit more maybe later. I don't think it's the key point of emphasis here. These are also, I think, in many cases misunderstood, partially due to legislators' kind of focus, at least in the past, on individual pieces of content, when really what they're focusing on or trying to focus on are like systemic level issues or harms. The NetzDG is a particularly good example of that, but maybe that's a question for later. So I just wanted to flag this and also mention that on the other side, there's a huge amount of informal regulatory work that is also being put in. And the EU has been leading on this through kind of codes of conduct on hate speech and disinformation. The disinformation one is about to get updated, I believe, in the next couple of weeks, and is going to become a kind of interesting hybrid tool, because I think some parts of it enforcement are potentially going to be in the DSA. But then there have been other initiatives, some of which involve multiple groups of stakeholders. So things like the Christchurch Call and the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism's expansion after the Christchurch shooting, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, as well as kind of more narrower single actor initiatives like the much discussed Oversight Board of Facebook. So all of these are basically new kinds of policy arrangements which are trying to set some kind of rules, standards, engage in the space of content moderation, platform governance in some way. The motives vary. I have work looking specifically at this if folks are interested, but I think that isn't really the scope of the talk today. This is just to say that, this is the important part, I guess, of the governance of platforms, is that there's been a lot of movement and increasing government interest in basically getting involved in the space. As Thierry Breton, the commissioner for the internal market in the EU, memorably tweeted, it's time to end the platform content moderation Wild West, as they say. So a lot of policymakers seem to be kind of following that long line of argument. So let's talk about automated content governance, automated content moderation, and the specific kind of ways where I think this platform governance conversation might intersect with the fact community's work and interests. So this is a table from the appendix of a paper that I worked on with my colleagues, Ruben Binz, who's at Oxford, computer scientist, and Christian Katzenbach, who's now at Bremen, who's a communication scholar. And in this paper, the citation's on the next page, I'll flag it for y'all. We are basically looking at trying to understand better the different ways that the major user-generated content platforms were using automated content moderation systems. And this is super important because, as we can kind of see on this table, first of all, every major user-generated content platform now, so ranging from messengers like WhatsApp, but also to the Twitters and the feed-based sites and the video-based sites, are all increasingly using some form of automated content detection. Even on something end-to-end encrypted like WhatsApp, they're using a hash matching database for child abuse imagery on things that aren't encrypted, on basically everything that is encrypted, such as, for example, profile photos of users. Basically, I guess we are interested in understanding like, how does this look in different domains? And also kind of trying to understand the political economy a little bit that has driven this. This is a direct result of the governance pressure that I just showed on the second slide. So basically, it seems to be a recurring pattern that when major companies have stakeholders breathing down their neck, so civil society too, not just governments, and saying, hey, you have X problem and you have this problem at scale, one of the classic things that platforms are developing are basically automated systems to try to meet some of those needs, right? And it makes sense. There's a huge amount of content that is being uploaded to these sites every day. And also in the last 5 years, coincidentally, there has been kind of increase, or at least purported increase, in the efficacy and accuracy of computationally driven matching tools, classifiers, etc. So just to give you a very quick rundown, across a broad range of content domains, platforms are already using a lot of different automated tools. And in the paper, we kind of bucketed these into two broad areas. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. There's probably some systems which blur the boundaries between these ideal types, but I think probably overall, the distinction we make here between matching-based systems and predictive-based systems, I think, is pretty helpful and probably holds across most cases. So the idea we basically introduced is that, at least in the content governance space, there are two broad ranges of automated systems. They have different affordances that we need to kind of understand. So the classic ones, which are using more, I guess, tried and true techniques from machine learning, are predictive tools, which are basically, using training data, trying to find statistical patterns on some type of content area, some type of content set that is being trained on, and then using that to predict the incidence of new content that it hasn't seen before, and then do something, right? And this can be either a kind of hard block or a content removal, or it can be, and of course this is a spectrum to follow Grimmelman, it can be a softer kind of result, like a flag, which then will get reviewed by a human in the loop at some point, a contractor somewhere in the supply chain, in the content moderation supply chain of a company, or it could be something more subtle, like a negative weight for an algorithm and being kind of downranked. So to give you some examples of this, as far as I'm aware, in my last kind of big overview of the space, the only predictive system outside of spam that was being used without a human in the loop, so is having the hardest kind of governance impact. So content was immediately being blocked and accounts potentially being immediately removed, is a very specific subset of terrorist content, which Facebook has said that it is deploying automated classification systems on. these will then be immediately removed without a human in the loop. For everything else, like we see on this slide here, regular violence, nudity, the companies have different classifiers that are detecting skin pixels, for example, that are detecting potentially violent material and will be having some kind of output. But as far as I know, this usually still has a human in the loop. And again, this isn't a panacea. This can still lead to issues, as we'll talk about, but they're putting some kind of safeguards in place here. And the second kind of big bucket of categories is what we call matching systems. So these are basically systems that are working slightly differently. The idea isn't to find a kind of new universe of content that is being uploaded by users and try to understand whether or not that might violate your guidelines. The idea here basically is to find content that really violates your guidelines already. And this in practice is used almost, I think, exclusively in three areas: copyright, terrorism, and child abuse imagery. And these kinds of systems basically say, okay, we have like a ground truth. We have a database of content that we know is not permitted. And then we're going to use cryptographic hashing or non-cryptographic hashing, like P hashes, perceptual hashes, to basically create a statistical fingerprint of pieces of content. And we're then going to try to find existing or potentially future instances at the point of upload instances of that content. So to try to explain that maybe a little bit more clearly one more time, the idea basically, it's a bit technical in terms of its actual implementation. We tried to break it down as kind of simply as we could in this paper here. My colleague Ruben Binns wrote a great kind of accessible primer on some of the technologies underpinning this, which I would recommend checking out. The idea is relatively simple, at least in practice, which is that you're hashing. So you're creating fingerprints of images, of videos, and then you're comparing them at the point of upload to what you already have in the hash list, right? And the idea here is that basically it's much computationally cheaper and easier for you to scan. So I upload something on Facebook now. I think according to the latest policy updates I've seen from them, virtually every type of content that people upload is now being hashed. So text as well as images, video, audio. At the point of upload in the half second before my post goes onto Facebook, they're doing a fingerprint of that content, and then we're searching it against, a hash list of potentially millions of items. And if there are hashes or if there are matches or things that are very, very close to being matches, again, depending on the hash technology they're using, this will be blocked. And there might be also some kind of other kind of outcome. So there could be a strike on my account could be blocked, I could be theoretically referred to the authorities, etc. So the idea here is that, yeah, we're matching known content and we're using that to detect new instances of that same content. Okay, so I can talk a little bit more about some of these systems, and I'm going to talk about two in the following slides. I'm going to talk about Content ID, and I'm going to talk about the GIFCT terrorism hash database. But basically, this slide is just to talk a little bit more about how these types of systems are being used across a variety of contexts, a variety of platforms, and also the kind of role that humans have in these systems is very different. And again, I think it's quite interesting. Who are the trusted actors in the system? Who's allowed to upload content to the hash database, for instance? Is anybody allowed to do this? What kind of permissions are involved? Especially since these hash databases usually share content across a lot of partners. So who has the permissions, the authority to make definitive updates to this database? Is there anyone auditing them in case something gets in there by mistake? How else do we kind of think about this? On the predictive side, it's more about data labeling and then data evaluation in terms of looking at the outputs of things that have been usually flagged. Okay, here I can't help myself but to tell a possibly apocryphal anecdotal story I've heard about Facebook's early efforts to create a a hate speech classifier. And I can't confirm any of this, if this is 100% true or not. But let's just say I've heard this from a few people with reliable sources. And this story, I think, is interesting because it helps us think a little bit about some of the, I guess, fairness, accountability, and transparency implications of a system like this, even when we think we're putting in appropriate safeguards. And the story is basically that this company is trying to experiment with hate speech classification on its platform. And what they do is they just start with basic, like, keyword oriented approaches. And what happens at first is that they're pulling down a lot of content, right? So they train some classifiers on hate speech data set, focusing especially on, keywords that are racial slurs, for example, that create kind of high toxicity scores, and thus lead specific content to get flagged for further review. And the metric for evaluating the success of the system is the question of how many instances of content that were flagged by this system, this automated system, were then confirmed by a human moderator. So we have a human in the loop, right? And the system is just flagging, it's not removing anything on its own. And the system is flagging a lot of stuff, and a high percentage of that content, let's say 80, 90%, I don't know, can't remember, is actually being actioned and removed by firm moderators. And at first glance, the system looks like it's working super well, right? I mean, that's, not bad for a first start, first cut at this training data, first attempt to deploy this classifier, pretty good. And what happened though, when the company starts looking a bit deeper at what's going on, and they start doing what they call I don't know if they actually call this anymore, but basically like an in-depth, what I've heard one company called the ground truth machine, or like a God mode analysis, where basically someone more senior at the company can dive into these specific pieces of content and see way more context than the moderator does, right? Because the tricky thing is that when these humans are actioning this content later, and these content moderators, who again, as a lot of scholarship has shown, are often not working in great conditions, are forced to action content in a very short period of time, and don't have a lot of context about it. They just see, I don't know, a snippet of text with hate speech, but they don't know the identity of the speaker. They don't know the broader social chain, the conversation. Basically, there's a lot of things that look like hate speech, but kind of on further examination are probably not, or are not. So for example, a lot of rap lyrics, a lot of cases of people hate speeching themselves, groups that have reclaimed slurs and are using them commonly to refer to themselves or to their friends. Again, in a non-hateful context. Again, this just shows you about how complicated this area is, and safeguards, even when built in with good intentions by companies, often don't fail. So anyway, that's just an aside. Let's move on very quickly to talk about two systems that I think are interesting in this space. So the first one is Content ID, which is, I think, probably the kind of granddaddy of hash matching content moderation systems. And it was developed by YouTube in this turbulent legal period. It had, I believe, been acquired by Google already, but there was a lot of pressure that it was facing, including a lawsuit from Viacom, and just like a lot of Hollywood, Motion Picture Association, etc., breathing down its neck. And the kind of, bargain that it struck to get copyright holders off of its back was to try to scale it through automated means. And these various efforts and experiments that it developed eventually kind of coalesced into a thing that is now called Content ID. And basically this is a p-hashing system, which is really interesting in the way that it's been implemented from the kind of rights holder perspective. So basically how it works is that it allows rights holders to go onto a special portal and upload their content. So this can be videos, right? This can be songs. So they could upload, for example, the catalog of a certain artist. And then those will be hashed. Those audio files will be hashed by the content ID system. And then they will basically keep those hashes kind of, on file. And it will search all kind of new future uploads of a song or of a video, whatever is being uploaded by users to YouTube for matches to this copyrighted content, to this copyrighted song. And what's really interesting and has been shown in empirical work of the system, which I'd recommend, we cite a lot of it in our paper, is that it looks at the different options that it presents the rights holders in this process. And interestingly, the most popular option is not actually content removal, it's demonetization, or maybe more accurately, remonetization, because the system basically by default gives copyright holders an option, if there is a match found, to basically take the advertising revenue that would go to that video and just transfer it to their own account. And the reason this is interesting from a kind of policy perspective is that the ways that the system was developed over time has meant, as legal scholars who are experts in copyright, unlike myself, have shown in a lot of empirical work, is that it's led to a system that has been really tilted towards the rights holders, to copyrights holders and their interests over users and creators. So because the emphasis is basically on not getting sued by copyrights holders, the system has been architected in a way that is the number one priority of the system. First of all, we're taking rights holders at their word as privileged kind of keepers of copyrighted content, and also probably as guardians and judges of what is considered fair use. So the copyrights holders might make mistakes in uploading certain content. This has happened many times before. And for users who might actually unjustly be faced with the content removal because something is fair use, or in some cases, it could actually be an error in the system, it could be a false match, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to appeal or reverse the decision. The system itself is quite obscure for people who are subject to it. So for creators, for example, it's not usually clear whether their content was demonetized or taken down because of a content ID claim, or if it was flagged for some other reason. So there isn't a lot of explainability in the system that would kind of allow users to know more about why a decision was made, or to contest that decision. Again, I think there are appeals processes in place, but they're very burdensome. And again, all the empirical work I've seen on this has kind of explored the creator strategies to dealing this, which is basically move on, you're not going to get this money back, make another video. And in this process, in practice, you also get a lot of interesting kind of second order effects on the creator ecosystem. So for example, there's a lot of folk theories. People have different, strategies, very specifically doing all sorts of things to try to make sure that they don't get flagged by accident. Folks are really careful about how they engage with the system and how they produce videos on YouTube, more broadly, to be frank, because they're really worried about being demonetized. So again, you have a kind of opaque system with this kind of political economy, which I think is just interesting to highlight. Okay, so one more example. Thanks for bearing with me. I hope I'm super jet lagged, so this might not be coherent at all. But yeah, I hope it's still somewhat interesting for y'all. So let's just talk about very briefly one more example. And in the tutorial, I hope to talk a little bit more and provide more examples of predictive systems. This is another hash system, which to me are just super fascinating kind of socio-political infrastructures that have emerged in the last few years. So here's another one. It's run by an organization called the Global Forum to Counter Extremism, to counter violent extremism, aka GIFCT. And what I think is really interesting about the GIFCT is the way that it was created, first out of a kind of process of almost bilateral negotiation between companies and European security officials through informal secretive fora like the EU Internet Forum, which was spun up in 2015, brought together law enforcement in Europe, Europol, etc., brought together internal ministries. Ministries of the interior, other kind of member state level security officials. So the interesting thing about this organization, which has long frustrated civil society for various reasons we can talk about, is that it basically is created in this environment of heavy government pressure around terrorism, counterterrorism, countering violent extremism. And it begins as a kind of voluntary commitment that Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Twitter make to European security officials after the EU Internet Forum and after a illegal online hate speech code of conduct that they sign with the European Commission in 2016. This is like an informal industry kind of capacity sharing body that they set up. It's just like a very informal thing. But after the Christchurch shooting and a lot of pressure from different governments, including New Zealand and France, it has been steadily formalizing and actually becoming a real international organization of sorts. So it's now a 501c nonprofit in the US. It has various kind of governance structures in terms of a board. Interestingly, also, it now has an advisory committee, which I believe includes both governments, both certain states like the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as civil society actors. And they have a kind of civil society network that has been part of this. And the main product of this organization now is a hash database, which is being shared. It was initially created by these 4 companies. Now I think 14 or more, 15, 16 different platforms of different sizes and types are using this as well. So yeah, they're taking the hashes that the major companies are using, and they're also scanning. So like LinkedIn, for example, is now also using this hash database. And I think there's a lot more that we could say about this, and I would like to say at the tutorial, but for now, I just wanted to bring this up as a kind of another example of the way that the political economy of these spaces is really important. So there's a lot of concerns with this organization that civil society has had for a long time. They've written a number of open letters about this org and the kind of potentially outsized role it has in content governance, but the major transparency and process concerns that exist with it. So as far as I know, there's never been an actual audit of what is in this database. We don't know how many hashes are in it. We don't know the scope of content. There is a little bit of an arms race that goes on with hashes in terms of actors who are trying to modify content and game the hash systems to get things onto platforms versus, the people trying to keep things down. But on the flip side, the idea that you would have trusted parties who can do actual comprehensive human rights audits of these systems, actually go into these databases and see what's in there, see if there's anything there by mistake. Again, lots of interesting stuff could happen if people were able to get adversarial content in there, which is looks like something, but is generating hash matches on something else entirely. Again, there's just so much interesting stuff that could happen there. So yeah, there's some broader kind of more philosophical questions, which Bharath Ganesh and other colleagues working in this space, Courtney Ratch, Gillian York, Emma Valenzo at CDT have raised in a lot of work, who's defining the scope of entry into this database. What exactly is terrorism? Again, this is a highly contested question, and different governments in different parts of the world have different local groups, which they may or may not want to constitute as terrorist organizations. Again, this is highly political, highly contested. And I guess the interesting thing that's happening here is that these political decisions are then being encoded in infrastructure that is being deployed at scale by major platforms with zero visibility into the broader kind of ecosystem and public. So anyway, that's just a broad reflection. So just to kind of tie together these things on the GIFCT, this, while I'm talking about hash sharing databases here, we've also seen these similar kind of pressures through and around other organizations like the GIFCT. So GIFCT also has a kind of annual meeting, which recently has become a little bit more public in terms of how it's talked about. And this is also a kind of fora, a transnational fora, which brings together national security officials, security, counterterrorism people from major governments with platforms in Palo Alto to kind of discuss the state of the field and to discuss different techniques that are being developed. And I think that the growing influence and pressure on companies is also leading to more predictive classification, right? So it's not just hashing, it's also, using automated content detection of hate speech or of terrorist content. And again, there's what's interesting is that there isn't always a human in the loop, as I mentioned. So in some cases, the companies have made the decision that the harm of having this content stay up vastly outweighs the harms of it being taken down erroneously. So they're erring on the side of caution. Again, there's an argument to be made for this, but at scale, with the platforms, with the scale that the platforms are operating, even very small margins of error could lead to thousands or tens of thousands of erroneous takedowns. And again, the question is there are fact questions here, I guess is what I'm saying. And the final thing to mention is that this is something which has been enshrined through informal regulatory kind of negotiation, what some civil society critics might call shadow regulation. There are also pressures coming from formal law, either explicitly or implicitly, that are also pressuring companies to deploy these types of systems. So by, for example, putting in timelines around content, as the EU's terrorist content regulation did, right? The famous 1 hour takedown after reporting. It's forcing companies to deploy more and more automated tools. So these are kind of the three broad things I wanted to offer for our discussion, both virtually, if that will happen on next week, or in the tutorial. And these are kind of three relatively simple points. I'm really interested in all of your takes, especially as kind of more specialists working in maybe this space from a more technical side. So the first one, again, I hope this is pretty clear, but I think that this form of algorithmic platform governance really matters, and it's starting to matter more and more. So from one hand, I mean, I get it. This isn't like a quote unquote high risk or high stakes space of algorithmic decision making. This isn't a recidivism algorithm. This isn't a healthcare algorithm. But I think at scale over an entire population, these systems can have a significant impact. They can still have a significant impact on people, especially given future trends. If we're getting things like on-device scanning, or we're getting increasing pressure from governments to intensify the let's say the governance outcomes that are happening as a result of these systems. So if the trend goes the way that, oh yeah, it's not just your content being blocked at the point of upload if there's a hash match, but oh, you're actually also being referred to the police. Well, that is, yeah, the stakes just got a lot higher in terms of false positives, for example, because yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear. So I think the space matters, and it's just going to continue to get more interesting. The second point, and again, I haven't gone into super depth on this, and I hope this is something we can talk about in the discussion. But I think there's a lot of fairness, accountability, and transparency issues with these existing moderation systems. And this happens not only on matching systems, on predictive systems. Y'all will be way more expert on, the fairness bias, broader justice concerns with, for example, hate speech classification in NLP than I am. But the thing that I guess I wanted to highlight here is that even in things which, from a computational point of view, seem less risky, and are making, not necessarily predictions, but just finding known instances of content, there's still big issues in these hash databases as they've been currently executed, in terms of their opacity, the lack of auditability, the lack of explainability or contestability from a user's perspective. So yeah, I think this is something that is increasingly being highlighted in the platform governance work that is looking at automated systems of content moderation. But again, it's something that we really, I think, need to keep diving into and exploring in depth in future work. And maybe just as a quick aside here, I think part of the challenge is that we don't really have any empirical data to go on, because these databases are kept very classified, very secretive, very opaque. So, nobody's done, I guess, a kind of adversarial audit of some of these databases, of the GIFCT database, or at least released it publicly and talked about its confidence intervals, how well it fares under certain conditions, how often it seems to get things right, get things wrong. Again, I think this is an important issue, and we're going to need to talk about new forms of, I guess, governance institutions to try to rein these systems in. And I realize that it seems a bit ironic, given that part of the reason that this is happening is also because of government stakeholder pressure. But I think there's a way to build in safeguards around these systems in legislation, for example. And finally, my last point here, and I guess this won't be news either to the more kind of critically oriented fact community, but I think the questions of power and of the broader political economies under which these systems are created are really important. And just through these two kind of super short examples I've given you, I've tried to kind of suggest that the context in which the systems are created really have big consequences, right? So in the content ID case, because this was really set up to kind of pacify and head off legal challenge from powerful rights holders in the early days of YouTube's development, the way that the system persists today still is really shaped in a way that privileges rights holders over creators. So that's the political economy kind of foundation of that system and how it was created, and the context in which it was created kind of persisting to this day and having long-term implications. And I think the same can be said probably about GIFCT. And I guess this is the maybe troubling or interesting question that I've started to kind of interpret in my work too, which is this question of like, okay, is there anything that can be done about it? Because on one hand, a lot of government stakeholders don't really care that much. They just want more resources being thrown at these issues. They don't want less. They think automated systems are realistically part of the solutions. And again, partially that's because that's how they have been marketed by the companies who have been talking to them formally and informally for the last few years. And they're baking in incentives that require increasing dependency on automated moderation systems in all sorts of regulatory initiatives. I guess the broader takeaway for me is that power is important here. And as of right now, in a political economic context where the impetus is simply to improve capacity building and resource sharing and build technical solutions, and it's less on being very careful on making sure that there aren't knock-on effects to these systems. Having careful auditing, having some kind of system of community trust building in terms of civil society and other kind of key observers in the system. If that isn't happening now, then I'm worried about our ability to kind of embed these things in the longer term. So I think that's it for this super strange jet lag edition of my talk on platform governance and automated content moderation. So thanks so much for tuning in. I'm looking forward to seeing some of you online. I'm also on Twitter. You can email me at the address above. And yeah, here are kind of three papers that I have done in this space that might be of interest to some of you. The first one I'd especially recommend if y'all are interested in this topic. This is the kind of primer I wrote with Ruben and Christian. And yeah, maybe my last kind of thing that I will just flag as a plug is that a group of colleagues and I have been organizing a conference, which is called the Platform Governance Research Network Conference. We had our first one last year online, and there's going to be another one this fall or winter. We're still in the process of finalizing details. And the idea of that conference is to basically expand the scope of folks working on things that are platform governance, having a definition of both platform that is as expansive as possible and governance that is as expansive as possible. So we're looking at different types of platforms, all sorts of different things from labor to user-generated content to broader kind of political economic critiques. And we'd love to see more work from this community there. So yeah, stay tuned for that call for papers in the coming weeks/months. And yeah, I really hope to see some of you either in person in Seoul or online. And yeah, thanks for listening. I'll see you around.